resiliency is something we learn. We learn how to be resilient because it's like we reached a challenge and we were able to get over it. And a lot of the kids with executive function issues don't have that. They haven't experienced enough success to develop resiliency. So we've that ability to continue to try. We've got to understand that persistence might be impaired in our kids because they've never experienced enough of the payoff that comes from persistence.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber. Dr. Ellen Braaten was one of my first guests on the Tilt Parenting podcast when she joined me back in 2016 to talk about her book about processing speed, Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. I'm so happy to be bringing her back to the show to talk about motivation, which is the topic for her wonderful new book called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less: How to Rekindle Your Child's Motivation. As the executive director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program at Massachusetts General Hospital and an associate professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, Ellen is widely recognized as an expert in the field of pediatric neuropsychological and psychological assessment, particularly in the areas of assessing learning disabilities and attentional disorders. In this episode, we explore motivation, or what we might perceive as a lack of motivation, from many different angles, including what is really going on when our child appears to be unmotivated, the relationship between executive function and motivation, how resilience comes into play, and the way in which we as parents and caregivers can support our kids in gaining confidence and skills so they can make meaningful progress towards the things that really light them up. I have already listened twice, read the book once, and will be going back for another read soon. If you've ever had the thought that your child doesn't care about the things that you feel they should care about, Ellen's work can offer a great reframe for considering all things motivation. Lastly, the doors to my Differently Wired Club are open this week. Please join us for the rest of the summer if you're craving a supportive community of parents navigating the same things you are. Plus virtual office hours, coaching calls, expert guests, and much more. Visit tiltparenting.com/club to join us. Thanks so much. And now here is my conversation with Dr. Ellen Braaten on kids and motivation. Hey, Ellen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me again. I love being here.
It's been many years. I think you were a guest of mine in the first year of Tilt Parenting, where we talked about your book, Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. Such a good book and a great episode. So listeners, go back and check that out if you haven't, because it is in the archives. But we're going to talk about your new book today. And before we get into that, I've read your bio, but if you could tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing in the world today, your why for doing it, maybe what's exciting you about the work you're doing today?
Oh, that's a great question. So I am a child psychologist who specializes in neuropsychology for my clinical work, which means like I assess kids with learning and attention and emotional differences and issues. And I'm also a researcher. I am an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. So I have both of these wonderful parts to my work where I'm working with kids and also getting to study them as well. And so my first book really came out of the fact that I was seeing a lot of kids struggling to sort of keep up. And a lot of them had learning disabilities or ADHD, but not all of them did. I think I first started thinking about that book about 12 years ago or so. So I wrote the book. I've studied that, what we call processing speed issues. And in the last 5 to 6 years, I was seeing a lot of kids who were having troubles getting motivated, staying motivated. And what I found was, well, what I thought was that many of those kids were the bright kids who couldn't keep up, who were growing up. And so I thought, oh, maybe it's just kids with processing speed issues, because that was sort of my area of research and my area of clinical expertise. But a lot of kids didn't have issues with processing speed. They didn't have any kind of issues. Maybe they were a little anxious or a little depressed, but they were really just feeling meh about life. And their parents were calling me worried. And so that's really the area that I became interested in. And in 2019, I approached my publisher because they were eager for me to write another book. I said, what about a book sort of about kids who couldn't care less? And actually, our working title was Bright Kids Who Don't Give a, and you can just fill in the blank. And it was really about kids who had a lot of issues, really significant trouble. And then 2020 happened. And so many kids are having trouble staying motivated, and adults for that matter. And so the book kind of broadened its scope into talking about motivation. How do we understand ourselves? How do we use our understanding of our kids and even ourselves to increase motivation, but really more than just motivation, but our love of life and a way of living in the world that's more in line with who we are and who we see ourselves to be. So that's kind of taken over now my area of research and clinical work. I talked more about the books than I did about what I do, but I love to write. I really still enjoy my work as a neuropsychologist and also the work that I do in my research.
Yeah, it seems like such a great blend of things. I can tell just in your voice that you're kind of in flow, which we'll talk about later, that this is kind of a very sweet spot for you and it benefits all of us. So I'm so grateful for that. You mentioned your book. It's called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, How to Rekindle Your Child's Motivation. Coming out of COVID, it's such an important topic. And within my community, motivation comes up all the time in so many different contexts. Also, this word laziness, a lot of conversations about laziness. Is it laziness? Or, my kid could do better, but they're not. And could we even start with definitions of motivation and laziness? How would you break those down?
Sure. Well, laziness is more like an adjective. It's a way of describing somebody's behavior, but it really doesn't mean much. I mean, we can all feel lazy when we're like, oh, I'm tired. It's not a very good term to think about when we're thinking about kids because most kids are not lazy. It's really more about an issue of motivation. And motivation is the why, or it's the reason we do the things that we do. So motivation can have a lot of different reasons. And there are lots of psychologists who have hypothesized about that. We get motivated because we want to do something because we like it. We want to do things because we want to sort of maintain our psychological status quo, meaning, we want to not be too much on edge and not too unmotivated. So, for example, we watch an exciting TV show when we're bored, or we take a bath when we're motivated to take a bath when our arousal levels are high. So that's another reason for motivation. And then other psychologists have talked about motivation in the way of, and some of your listeners might remember like the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the top is sort of self-actualization. At the bottom are our physiological needs. And so we've got to think about motivation in that way too, that if we don't have our basic needs met, we're not really motivated to do some of those higher things. For instance, friendships and that life or belonging needs are kind of in the middle. So if our friendships aren't going very well, the higher needs for self-esteem aren't going to be very motivational for us. So it's motivation, I guess, it was what I'm saying. It's complicated. There are a lot of pieces that make up reasons why we're motivated. So we can look lazy when we're not motivated, but it's complicated.
Yeah, it is really complicated. There's a part of motivation that seems to be almost like resilience or grit, this kind of thing that we're striving for. But it seems like there's no pathway to follow these steps and you instantly have a motivated child. And certainly that is the case. As you share, a lot of this is about us really getting to know our kids on a deeper level and understanding ourselves as well. I'd love to talk about these three major components of motivation. You described them as initiation. So initiation being the decision to begin an activity, persistence, the effort we put in, and intensity, the stamina required. So as I was reading that in your book, I was thinking, yeah, those are executive functions. You speak to that. And so what came up for me is So many of our kids are struggling with executive function challenges, and we're always led to think about how can we have our kids have more buy-in so that they're motivated to work on these executive functions. Yet those executive functions are key components of motivation. So I was having like a chicken and an egg moment as I was reading about this, and I'm wondering if it's similar, like the relationship between executive functions and motivation. Could you tease that out for us a little bit?
Yeah, I think you did a great way of explaining this. Motivation really has three different parts. I see a lot of kids with executive function issues with slow processing speed or ADHD. They start the semester, I really want to do well this semester. And so it's that initiation is that decision that I'm going to get started on this task, but it also includes the ability to get started on this task. And so that's an important component. And a lot of kids with executive function have trouble initiating or getting started on tasks. So they want to succeed. They don't know how. They don't know how to get started. And so if that's an issue for your child, that's a key. If we haven't fixed that, you're going to have a child who's in that constant circle of being unmotivated, because it's like, I was motivated to do it, but I didn't have the tools in order to get started on it. So therefore, motivation isn't something that I can even tap into. And then we have persistence, which is that effort that we put toward continuing to stick with it. So it's sort of like, all right, I got started on the history paper that I love history. You've got kids who even struggle in certain aspects of academics, but love the subject. All right, you help them get started, but they don't know how to try. And you mentioned resiliency, and all of that, it colors this. But resiliency is something we learn. We learn how to be resilient because it's like we reached a challenge and we were able to get over it. And a lot of the kids with executive function issues don't have that. They haven't experienced enough success to develop resiliency. So we've that ability to continue to try. We've got to understand that persistence might be impaired in our kids because they've never experienced enough of the payoff that comes from persistence. And then that intensity, that concentration that is important, that stamina is also hard for kids with executive functioning because of the attentional aspects that it takes to concentrate and be intense. Obviously, kids can struggle in all three of these areas, but it's really good to take a look at, is one more of a chronic problem for my child than the other? Because that can be a useful place of starting a conversation. You mentioned too that I wish there was a how-to list. There's a 5 steps for increasing motivation. It's not like that. Motivation is something we all struggle with on a day-to-day basis. We have to be motivated to do the things that are on our list. We've got to be motivated to get in the car to go to work. We've got to be motivated. These are skills that your child is learning. So we've got to look at this as an opportunity to help them build that skill. I use an example, something like saying to your child, I saw you were excited to start that project that your teacher asked you to do. I know the topic's something you're passionate about. What's getting in the way of helping you get it done? What do you need? What can I do to help? And that's really what I talk a lot about in the book, is that it's a lot about having conversations with our kids about what's getting in the way, while using our expertise as parents or even teachers as figuring it out too. So I'm not sure I answered your question exactly about the executive function skills, but we've got to look at these things as working hand in hand, that the motivation is requiring executive function skills, and we can use our knowledge about how we build executive function skills to build motivation.
That's great. You absolutely answered it and more, and makes so much sense. And I want to point out for listeners, one of the things that I really loved about your book is at the end of every chapter, you have something called Think, Talk, Do. So you provide prompts for what we should be and want to be thinking about as it relates to the content you just shared, what we want to talk about with our kids. And you have really wonderful suggestions and some language as well to really get to know your child's perspective or where they are with that topic and then what to actually do. So it's very practical in that way. When you were on the show first time, again, we were talking about slow processing speed, and you wrote that you've noticed many kids with a slower processing speed, especially ones who didn't get appropriate treatment or accommodations, grow up into kids who don't care. That was really interesting to me. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. So without the appropriate accommodations, so what happens when we are put into situations that we chronically can't manage, that we can't be successful in? Becoming unmotivated is the absolute the end thing that happens. We can't help it. You can't live a life where you're chronically feeling like I can't do the work that I'm asked to do within the time frame that I'm asked to do it. So without those appropriate accommodations and even an appropriate understanding. So for kids with slow processing speed, it's not even getting the right accommodations in school, like the extra time, all of those things that we talked about. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but it's even sort of looking at those kids over the course of a lifetime, that they're going to be perhaps slower than we think they should be in our society, that they should meet those timely goals. For instance, I talk about going to college right after high school, or even being ready for kindergarten at the same time. Of course, parents don't always have a neuropsych evaluation that shows their child's processing speed at age 4, but we tend to know our kids that they're like, it just seems like he's slower than everybody else in simple things like putting on his shoes, brushing his teeth in the morning. Life takes longer. And if life takes longer when we're talking about a morning activity, it's going to take longer when we talk about a lifetime. And that's okay. So I find that what happens with kids, a lot of kids actually with low motivation or who couldn't care less, but particularly kids with processing speed, they start even in middle and high school to look like unmotivated kids because they look at the future and they say, I'm not going to be ready for the life that you seem to think I need right now. And what you're saying is at 18, I'm going to have to go to college when I can barely manage the sorts of tasks you're asking me to do now in 8th grade. And so they show us, they don't know, we don't even know, but they show us that they're not prepared by not doing things, by saying, I can't do what you're asking me to do. And that's basically what an unmotivated person looks like. It's like, again, bringing up that concept of laziness, but really it's like, I can't do this. Nobody likes being lazy unless we're really talking about sitting by a pool on vacation. It's just, no one likes it. It's not something that makes us happy. So the kids with slow processing speed, they look a little bit unmotivated just by their characteristics. And so they kind of grow into this thing that everyone expects them to be or look like.
We'll be right back after a quick break. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon. And that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. A lot of the book is about parents' expectations, which I appreciated so much. That's a lot of what we talk about at Tilt Parenting is this mismatch between what we expected life as a parent, what we expected our kids to be like, and what is actually happening. And you wrote in a chapter called The Parenting App for Motivating Kids, you wrote, if you're thinking your child doesn't seem to like anything, is it possible that she just doesn't like what you expected? I thought that was so beautifully stated. And you then go on to present this framework, the parenting app, these 3 essential things that parents really should be considering when they're thinking that their child isn't motivated or they're at risk of not being motivated. Would you mind breaking down the parenting app for us?
Sure. So I developed this because I was having trouble getting a good framework for how do we conceptualize motivation and then what do we do? So the parenting app stands for 3 different areas: aptitude, pleasure, and practice. And so I break each one of these down in a chapter too. And for aptitude really talks about what is my child good at doing? And that's really, we've got to think back to your question or your reflection about sometimes the issue with motivation is what we thought our child was going to be, who we thought our child was going to be. And that's okay. We're always going to have that. It's just part of parenting. We think our child is going to be all the things that we wanted ourselves to be. It's normal. Throughout history, this is what happens. But what we want to do is look at who our child is, and that's where the aptitude comes in. What is my child good at doing? And sometimes when you've got a really unmotivated child, you've lost track of that. In some ways we know because we've got a neuropsych eval or a school evaluation, great. But in a lot of cases we don't. And so you need to start thinking about your child. Where's my child happiest? How much time does my child spend doing the things they like to do? What are their strengths? We've got to start thinking about strengths as more than just good grades, they're smart. But what about things like kindness and empathy and all the kinds of characteristics that actually make us good humans? We lose track of that. And a lot of times unmotivated kids are good at all of the things that we don't tend to value in childhood, like creativity, curiosity, bravery, honesty, zest for life, all of those things. So that's aptitude. And then pleasure is what are the kinds of things we like doing? And sometimes those are the things we're good at doing, but sometimes it's not. So I think about the child who's really good at playing the violin or at soccer, who's like, yeah, but I don't want to do that, Mom. Like, I don't care that I'm good at soccer and you love coaching it. It's not what gives me pleasure. And so looking at what are the sorts of things that my child likes doing, and then practices what are the sorts of things that my child does when they have time to do it. So what are the sorts of activities they return to without me prompting? Everybody's going to say video games, and that's true, but a lot of times kids do video games to blow off steam, not because they actually love doing it. They might like doing it, but just like for me, I scroll through Instagram when I'm feeling overwhelmed. It's like, oh, I don't want to get started on something. I find myself, do you know what I mean? So those three areas, we want kids to be sort of in the center of what their aptitudes are, what gives them pleasure, and what they tend to like spending time doing. So that's what that is. And it's a framework for sort of rethinking or starting to think about, all right, if I want to motivate my child, before I even think about the goals, I've got to think about who my child is, what they like doing, and what they spend time doing.
Yeah, I love that. And also can totally relate to the Instagram scrolling, as in my mind, I'm saying, what are you doing, Debbie? This is such a waste of time, yet I just need to sink into it sometimes.
Yep. Yeah. And I think being conscious of it helps. There's a term for it, and I didn't write it down. Somebody said this to me, but it's like, it's not even doom scrolling. It's like boredom scrolling. And that it's like, oh, when I'm feeling maybe even a little anxious or I got so much to do. If we're conscious of that, that's okay. So give us a break. We even do that with our kids. Come home from school, it's a lot for you to handle. What do you need to do to sort of chill out? So maybe going for a walk might be better for me, but maybe for a child, it's jumping on a trampoline, or it could be playing video games for 30 minutes. All right, do it. Let yourself engage in it, and now embrace the next step.
Well, I also just want to say I love the focus on strengths, and you talk a lot about that in the book, and that you presented all these different ways to look at strengths, including character strengths, which I think is so important. The pleasure chapter I also thought was super interesting. And you talk about opposites, and you describe the opposite of pleasure as being apathy. You said that can be a sign of depression or anxiety, but not always. And apathy is one of those really hard things for parents, because it feels for so many of us like this is a choice. Just care about something, right? It feels really hard for, I think, parents if they believe that their child is apathetic. And I'm wondering if you have any other insights to what is behind apathy, if we're noticing that.
I think apathy comes, especially for kids, when they don't know exactly what to do. So we become apathetic when we don't have good goals, and when we don't know what the next step is for us. Apathy can also be signs of depression. It can also be a sign that your child has lost friendships. You want to ask them, I see that you're spending a lot of time doing X, Y, or Z, spending time in your bedroom, whatever it is. You want to define what that is and then talk to them about that. But most of the time, it has a root in anxiety combined with a lack of a goal. A lot of times I find kids looking like they're apathetic because they've been doing something and it didn't work out, and parents and kids don't know what the next step should be. For a lot of kids, it's that spinning their wheels phase. And so the best thing to do about that is to start to think about, okay, what's the next step? And I also should say too, some kids become apathetic because they've got too much on their plate. So even as adults, again, I try to connect this to us, because this all happens with us too. We become apathetic when it's like, I have too many things to do, so I'm just going to do none of them, or nothing looks good. When we're over challenged, we can become apathetic too. So I want to make sure this isn't just an issue with kids who have learning differences or processing speed issues, but also for some of those high achieving kids who are like, I'm done. 5 AP classes and like, I just don't care about life anymore. It can hit a lot of different kids in a lot of different ways. That what looks like a super motivated kid can become an apathetic kid because they're like, I'm overwhelmed.
I love that you relate that as well to an adult experience. Maybe this is just me talking, but I don't think I'm alone here, that we forget that our kids have their own internal experience and all the things that at this point in our lives, I've learned so many hacks for myself, and I've worked through so many different emotional ups and downs and how to navigate lack of motivation and all of these things. And we feel like our kids should get it because we tell them one thing and we have this wisdom to share. And we forget that our kids are on their own journey of developing and growing and learning these things. It's something they have to go through.
Yeah, totally. And that's why like you mentioned at the end of every chapter, is like what to think about. It's really what the parents can think about. And a lot of times it relates to their child, but also to us. And that they're watching our journey as we're doing it. So if we have a life that's not filled with a lot of pleasure, how do we expect them to find pleasure in their lives? Most parents will say to me, almost when I ask, what are your expectations for your child? I want my child to be happy. But yet we as parents aren't always continuing our quest for happiness at the same time that our children we're putting this pressure on them. We want our kids to be happy. Well, you know what? Maybe we should be working on ourselves a little bit more about that and figuring out what gives us pleasure, because that's a role model too. We think about, it's important for us to be reading so our kids develop a love of reading. We also need to be tapped into what's making us happy, and not just our kids are making us happy, but what is it that we loved? And what is it that we could be doing? I'm not saying we should all just run off to Italy and learn cooking, but that we should infuse our life with pleasure so that we can provide good role models for our kids about what pleasure means to them or for them.
I'd like to run off to Italy and do some cooking. That sounds really nice.
I'd love to run off to Italy and have someone cook for me, actually. But yes, yeah.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
You just shared these 3 components in the framework. So there's aptitude, pleasure, and practice. And you present them in the form of a Venn diagram that we're kind of building. And you talk about flow as living in the center of that Venn diagram. Can you talk about what flow is and how we can recognize when our kid is in flow?
Yeah, so flow was a term that was developed by a very famous psychologist who I always have trouble pronouncing his name, Csikszentmihalyi, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he really studied the pursuit of happiness. And it's that state where we're so engrossed in a task that we forget to eat lunch. It's that state that we're in where we're not overly challenged or underly challenged, but just blissfully happy. It's not even that state of writing a paper or something like that, but just that state of where we're really in that sweet spot where we can feel confident and we're being challenged, but just enough. We need to have the skills so that we can be in that level. And so we don't want a task that's too challenging, but if we're very skilled in a certain area, we do have to have challenging tasks. I don't know if I explained that correctly, but it depends on our skill level. So if we're just learning something, we want the task to be such that it's just hard enough for us to be able to do it well, but to also be just inching up our way to another level in that skill. So to move kids from apathy to flow, we've got to have two things to happen. They need to feel successful in their ability to complete the task, and they need the environment to challenge them to think. It's an environment situation and also a skill situation. And I find that those two things aren't always in tandem when we're finding kids who are struggling. So kids are put into situations where they're not challenged enough. So they seem apathetic or unmotivated. So we move them down a section in their math class. There's either that or there's a push for them to be less bored. Oh, they need to be more challenged. And so we need to think about both of those. To get that dynamic correct is kind of troubling, and you're not going to fix it overnight. But you need to sort of think about, what does my child need to be in that flow? Do they need more services? Do they need fewer services? Do they need to be challenged? But we've got to kind of think about that. And then I think there are also things that get in the way of flow and that tend to make kids more that apathetic. Not enough sleep, for example. If we are tired, we can't be in flow. And we forget to mention how much sleep is part of all of these things that we're talking about. When kids are overscheduled, it's hard to be in a flow. If we've got too much in our calendar, we don't have time to be in that sweet spot. And so I think those are other things that get in the way of being in that flow.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about the connection between that flow state and motivation. I think so many parents, again, going back to expectations, we want our kids to be motivated about the things that we think are important. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that we want to help identify those places where our kids are in flow, because that is actually a very motivating place for them to be. And it's not that we can then take the motivation there and pivot it to the things that we care about, but rather, how can we build? You talk about goodness of fit. Where can we build their strengths and continue to grow motivation in places where they're already feeling that? Am I getting that right?
You're getting it perfectly correctly. Yes, that's what we exactly want to do. Kids need time to be able to do that. And that's where it takes time for us to find the things that we love. Oftentimes in the course of a life, again, sort of bring it back to you, we lose that, when was the last time you felt happiest as a parent? Now apply that to your child. Like for me, I love writing. I don't always have the time that I want to do that. But when I keep that in mind, it's like, okay, I've got to build that time for doing nothing, not just to say, oh, I'm going to sit down, but I've got to build time into thinking about that. So if you've got a child who's creative, if you've got a child who loves music or something, you've got to build that time in. You've also got to build in time for kids to putz around, to find what it is that they would like to do in order to reach that flow.
Yes. One of the things that you addressed in the book that I actually haven't seen come up in many of the books I've read and covered on this show is this idea of temperaments. And that really resonated for me. We talk about brain wiring and neurodivergence and things like that. But temperament as a concept doesn't often come up. And it really jumped out at me as something that's a consideration. There's the nature versus nurture, but who is our child and what is their kind of natural inclination, and how important that is to understand how their temperament fits into all of this. Is there anything that you can walk us through with that concept?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so glad you brought this up because when I was writing the book, my editor was like, oh, do we need temperament again? Because in a lot of psychology books, it's part of child development, but we don't really use it as a way of describing kids as they grow. So temperament is really that general behavioral style that it's the way we react to and express and regulate our emotions. And we talk a lot about temperament when we have a baby. Do they have an easy temperament or a less easy temperament? Is it the kind of child who's crying all the time, colicky? And it's funny because I have my first great niece. I'm a great aunt now. It makes me feel old. She's only a month old. And 2 weeks after she was born, there's this picture of her where her arms were outstretched above her head and she looked like she was sort of like yelling. And somebody remarked in the picture on Facebook, oh, that looks just like her. Now she's only 14 days old, but already people were making remarks about her temperament, that she's kind of a strong-willed baby. And those labels, either shy or easy baby versus strong, those things last. And those labels, I will have parents come in with a 14-year-old and say, oh, he was hard from the day he was born. And those, we've got to explore what are the kinds of labels we put on our child from the very beginning. And some of them are accurate, but a lot of them aren't. And, things like, are they a very agreeable kind of kid? Did they move with the punches? All of that. And then we also have to understand our own temperament. Are we the sort of person who's more extroverted or introverted, and our child is the opposite? Are we having disagreements about that? But I also think it's important for us to reframe our language about some of these temperamental characteristics. Like the difficult baby, we can also look at that as strong-willed. And I put some of these in there. The bossy toddler, we could reframe that as determined. Or the slow kind of kid, the easygoing baby, you're like, oh, he's been slow since the day, he was born. We could say easygoing. Slow can be easygoing. The annoying kind of kid is a persistent person too. And we can help use that. That doesn't mean that sometimes these labels are absolutely correct. Kids can have sort of annoying personality, but there's a way that we can use that to reframe the way we think about our kids and how they think about themselves, because they grow up to think I'm an annoying person. Nobody likes me. All right. You know what? It is, but let's look at it as persistence. Let's look at that picky eater as the discerning kind of eater. It's not like we want to just pretend these things aren't happening, but we want to help reframe it, because those sorts of labels are very demotivating to us as we come into ourselves.
Yeah, it really did jump out at me, I think, for those very reasons. I think the label that I use often is tricky to describe a lot of the kids in this community and my own human, but challenging, strong-willed, spirited. I guess spirited could be negative or positive. But anyway, I really just appreciated that you included that as part of this.
Yeah, and tricky, I think that's good too. We like tricky in a lot of ways. It means it's complicated. It means we have to think about it. It means that, this child deserves my highest level of concentration when I have it, because we're not unlimited. But to kind of think about that as it's tough, but it also means that it's going to challenge me to be a better mom too, or dad, or, parent.
Good reframe. So part 3 of the book is keys to helping your child care more. And you have a chapter where you talk about goals. And I'm going to pull out a quote from the book. Kids who couldn't care less are very often kids without goals. If they do have goals, the goals aren't often shared by the people who love them. So identifying appropriate goals and using them to motivate behavior and find meaning in life is one of the most important ways to help your child. I want to say, first of all, that I love that. And as a goal-oriented person, I wrote a book for teens on how to set and reach goals. I'm all in. And I know that so many parents in my community have kids who are very demand avoidant and might really bristle at the thought of creating a goal that might feel like a demand. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts for parents who want to lean into developing goals to help their child feel more motivated, but they're worried their kids might push back.
Nobody likes to have goals forced on them. That's a demand, and we hate that. Everyone hates it. Kids hate it the most. I do talk about setting goals, but there are better books like yours on how to do that in depth. My book really talks about how to use that information about our kids as a way of starting those conversations about goals. And so I think the best way to approach goals is by starting a conversation about it. And the one thing I find that parents that I work with have trouble with is they don't realize, and maybe you could even give me better words to describe this, but that a goal is sort of an aspiration that needs to change. And that we're always disappointed when we don't make our goals, but really it's just a first step. And goals need constant revising. And we don't have that as part of the whole goal setting. But I think the best way to start with a really unmotivated child is to get them to talk about what are the sorts of things you want to do. And you might have to start with what makes you happy. And they might even come back and say, well, nothing. And then you've got to have a discussion about that. But let's say they can come up with some things. Then it's, what do you look forward to doing? What are the sorts of things that make you feel excited? What do you want to get out of this school year? What do you want to do after high school? And to even have questions, even in middle school, about it's not going to be that long before you start high school and finish high school. Where do you see yourself? And some kids are going to talk about college and others aren't. Even having things, talking to them about what kinds of things are hard for you, but you like to do them anyway. And what are the sorts of things that are easy for you, but you hate doing them? So those are the sorts of things, and they should be part of a family's vocabulary. Lots of talking about those sorts of things. What do you hope to accomplish this school year, this season, this week, in your history class? All of those sorts of things are really good ways of starting to think about goals and goal setting.
Thank you. And listeners, I want to reiterate the book is called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less, How to Rekindle Your Child's Motivation. And I really just enjoyed this book because it made me think really critically about my role where I'm stuck. You talk about having a flexible mindset, but it's not just for our kids, it's for us as well. And there's so much goodness in here to really help us change our thinking about what motivation looks like and then how to really support our kids in experiencing just more pleasure and competency in their own life. So is there anything before we say goodbye that we didn't touch upon that you would really want to make sure listeners take away from this conversation?
I just want to mention too that there are times when this kind of demotivated kid, it needs more than just the sorts of things we've talked about. And just the behaviors that are of concern are the things that you want to look at and know when you need to reach out for help are constant feelings of low self-esteem, feeling inferior to others, lots of problems getting along with peers or no friends, feelings of anxiety, depression, changes in sleep, all of the things that are indicators for significant anxiety and depression. And if that's happening, a lot of the things we've talked about aren't going to work because we've got to treat the child for the depression or the anxiety. I mean, you can have some of these discussions, but it's really hard to even talk about what makes you happy if you're really depressed. So just be aware of that. Don't be afraid to seek help if that's what you think might be happening, and make sure that you take care of that as well.
Thank you for that. I know that that's going to resonate with so many listeners who are raising kids who are having mental health challenges right now. So thank you for that. And where would you like listeners to check out you and your work?
My book is available in your local bookstores, or you can order it from your local bookstores if they're not there, in all of the normal places, barnesandnoble.com and all of that. I also have a website, ellenbraatenphd.com, where you can get more information about this and also about processing speed and some of the other things that we've talked about.
Awesome. Thank you. Listeners, I'll have links to that in the show notes as always. And Ellen, this has been such a great conversation. I so appreciate everything that you shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I loved it too.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. To go deeper into this episode, visit the extensive show notes page. For every episode, there's a dedicated page on my website with links to all the resources mentioned, a full transcript, and a podcast player with key takeaways marked so you can easily go back and re-listen to the sections you're most interested in. Just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this episode. The Tilt Parenting Podcast is hosted by me, Debbie Reber, author of the book Differently Wired and the founder of Tilt Parenting. This episode was edited by Andrea Curtis Amasquita, and show notes were put together by myself, Andrea, and Lindsay McFadden. If you get a lot out of this podcast and want to help cover the cost of its production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. On Patreon, you can sign up to make a small monthly contribution, as little as $2 a month, and it's super easy to sign up. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more, or click on the Patreon link on any show notes page. To follow Tilt Parenting on social media, go to @tiltparenting on Instagram and Twitter, and on Facebook. Lastly, please help this podcast stay visible and easily found by the listeners who need it by subscribing and leaving a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information about this podcast or any of the resources that Tilt offers, visit tiltparenting.com.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.